Okay, second problem. In 1951, philosopher W.V. Quine publishes this paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Uh, Two Dogmas of Empiricism is one of the most important philosophical works of the 20th century, definitely from the perspective of philosophy of science, right? Um, in this work, he points to he argues against the logical positivist approach, right? He thinks this distinction between analytic and synthetic truths, and then the verification condition that the logical positivists have proposed are ill-advised. Let's say that. Um, Quine argues as an alternative for what we call a holistic approach to knowledge. He argues that we can only test a proposition holistically, and if he's correct about that, positivism and its take on the empiricist project in general is fatally flawed, right? And so we're gonna sort of spell that out. Now, if you remember this, the logical positivist says again, all truths are analytic or synthetic, right? So analytic truths, true by definition. You understand the concepts involved and the words and the relationships between those concepts, and you know that the sentence is true or false, or you can at least derive whether or not the sentence is true or false. Um, Synthetic truths, they are mean what their verification conditions turn out to be, and so they are true if their verification condition is the case, right? Again, water is H2O is true if the liquid we call water is actually H2O. It's false if that liquid is not H2O, right? What the holistic approach says is any of those sentences, whether they're analytic or synthetic, can only be understood in a broader context. That sort of makes sense really quickly for an analytic truth, right? Like if you think about a word like bachelors are unmarried, like a phrase like bachelors are unmarried, that is only true. It could only possibly true. That sentence can only be understood if you're stating it within the context of a language, right? So you have to state bachelors are unmarried in a like in the natural language of English, right? And then you have to know what a bachelor is, what an unmarried is, and you have to know how those concepts are related to each other and what an art is, right? So you need to know all this stuff about the language you're using. And there's a bunch of assumptions that come to bear just for you to be able to say bachelors are unmarried. The same thing with mathematical truths, right? Math is in some sense a language, right? It's a description of the world. You have to understand what those words and phrases and relationships mean in order to even know something simple like 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? So you have to look at those sentences within the context of a larger theoretical framework for you to understand what they are even stating. And if you don't have that framework, then they're just meaningless noise. So even something simple like a elementary arithmetic uh, truth requires all this baggage, right? It requires all this conceptual machinery to be in place and accepted and tentatively endorsed for you to make sense of or understand that 2 plus 2 equals 4. But it's the same thing for synthetic truths. He's going to say, in order to understand that water is H2O, you have to accept a whole bunch of things about observation, about what your observations mean, about how your tools work, about chemical composition, about chemistry. Like there's a bunch of stuff you have to bring to the table in order for you to have an observation that water is H2O. And without that stuff, you cannot even really have the observation, and you definitely can't understand your claim, right? So for somebody like Quine, knowledge is contextual. You cannot isolate the individual from the broader context that they're working in. You cannot study a sentence in and of itself. You can't take a proposition and isolate it. You always have to look at a proposition as part of a broader theoretical framework and as nowhere as part of a broader context, right? And that's a holistic perspective. So if we apply this to science, right? What we would think is we can't test a single hypothesis in isolation. We are always testing complex networks or sets of claims and assumptions, right? So you're always bringing a theory to the table, and you're always looking at and making predictions and getting observations um, within that context, right? And if you don't have that, you can't even be making a prediction or making an observation. So if he's right about that, then our logical positivist is in trouble because we can't essentially do the reduction of noise that's needed to get to the point where we have a synthetic truth that's just purely tested independent of theory and other assumptions. We're always testing within a context. Here's an example. Suppose you've got a statement like an effective teacher will score highly on a teaching assessment, right? Um, and so that sounds like a quantitative claim, right? If somebody's a good teacher, right, or an effective teacher, I guess we're saying, then if we do a teaching assessment, they will score highly on it, right? So there's our synthetic truth, and it's got a verification condition, right? Um, Teacher X, high scores on teaching assessment, right? Therefore effective, something like that. Um, in order to do all of that, we have to have a whole bunch of theories about what effective teaching is. We have to have a measurement tool. We have to assume that that measurement tool is accurately measuring effective teaching. So we have to have, and then we have to have a theory about how to interpret those results, right? So we have to bring all this stuff to the table to even do something simple like just get a statistical analysis of how effective a teacher is, right? Um, we have to assume student reports are reliable guides to effective teaching, like all that kind of thing. And without all that other stuff there, then the understanding of what an effective teacher will score highly on a teaching assessment even means is just not there, and the observation isn't there. So you can't get even a basic observation or determine a basic truth or falsity without like more stuff there than is merely the proposition. That's, I guess, as simplistic as I could probably make the idea. The text we're looking at has more sciencey examples. They talk about the association of high air pressure with stable weather patterns. So, and again, it's the same thing. You've got to bring a whole bunch of theory and framework to bear if you want to sort of talk about stable weather and high air pressure. But the general point here, right, is if Quine is correct about his holistic approach to understanding and knowledge, then the logical positivist picture is in trouble, right? You can't even determine the truth of analytic or synthetic truths unless you're bringing a whole framework to bear. So the project they want to do is completely impossible then, right? Now, Quine's work's incredibly influential, and it contributes to a move that was already in effect, but it definitely accelerates a move away from the logical positivist project, and people move from there to a much weaker version, right? The logical empiricist view, right? And the logical empiricists, what they did is they abandoned the verification principle of the positivists, and they replace it by a holistic approach of meaning, right? So for the logical empiricist, a theory is an abstract structure connecting many hypotheses, right? So think about like the germ theory of disease or the theory of evolution or something like that, right? What the logical empiricists would say is when we try to understand the world, we have these frameworks, right? These theoretical frameworks for understanding the world, right? The germ theory of disease brings a whole bunch of um, hypotheses and statements about the causes of illness and about what a germ is, like what a bacteria is or a virus, and how they evolve over time and how they work, right? And how they lead to disease. And that whole framework of sentences, right? A collection of hypotheses and statements about observations and about disease and its causes and about microorganisms and how they work. That whole thing explains certain kinds of diseases, right? So for the logical positivist, scientists would have a theory like that. It's a set of hypotheses that are connected together in a single set, and they explain a domain, right? They bring in a bunch of theoretical terms like gene, evolution, microorganism, virus, bacteria. These are theoretical terms. They're not things that are just like you have to have a concept to have that term, like, and to have that idea exist and that thing exist, or to be observable and understandable. And then our observations of them are predicted upon the theoretical structure, right? The theoretical structure tells us a bunch of things about how germs behave and how they relate to each other and how they relate to humans and so on, right? We're not then, as a logical empiricist, describing private sensations that an individual has, right? We're not this isolated person that can sort of do the work of figuring out what's true or false if we're just sort of carefully applying a method. Science is rather descriptions of observable physical objects, and the sense making is theoretical in nature, right? Um, and all that we're really doing as a good scientist, then, when we use scientific language, is not describing reality as it is, but describing observable patterns in the world, right? Within the context of our theory. And so that's what we're doing as a scientist if we're a logical empiricist. But that's a sharp move away from the ambitions and the views of the logical positivist. Take care.